I think it's fair to say that opioids are more physically addictive than many other substances because they create this phenomenon of dependence and really significant withdrawal.
That was Dr. Anna Lembke, author of Drug Dealer MD, which is all about how doctors contributed, however inadvertently or not, to the opioid epidemic. Hello, I'm your host MartinJon, the Recovery Mentor. I want to welcome you to the Recover Yourself podcast, where we address the topics you'll be facing while on a journey to recovering yourself. This podcast and my work with individuals and professionals has always revolved around expanding the scope of addiction and recovery. I want to do this so everyone can begin to recover themselves no matter where they are on the journey. In this episode, we get to explore where the opioid crisis is today, and we get to peer into how doctors were duped into duping and doping their patients. Dr. Anna Lembke breaks down the industry for us in this episode so we can get a better understanding of why our doctors spend what seems like as little time as possible with us. So I am really excited to have you on.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
I want to just address, you wrote Drug Dealer MD, and what a wonderful book, first off. And talking and taking responsibility as a doctor and from your perspective for what has happened with the opioid epidemic, and trying to give people power in this epidemic that we're having. Where do you see the epidemic today? Let's start there. This is a big thing to unpack. So where do you see the epidemic today?
Yeah, well, let me just go back one second to thank you for sort of acknowledging and taking ownership of my complicity and the complicity of my colleagues in the opioid epidemic. In calling the book Drug Dealer MD, I really did want to bring attention to the ways in which we as healthcare providers have contributed in a very substantial way to the opioid crisis that we face today, and really wanted people to own their part. And obviously physicians and prescribers are not the only responsible agents. We've got Purdue Pharma and others who have a huge role in this. We've got changes in the healthcare system in general. We've got changes in our culture around pain and how we perceive pain. There are many, many different factors. It's complicated, but it was really important to me to call attention to our role as healthcare providers without necessarily vilifying, every single prescriber, because we're mostly not bad people, honestly, and it's understanding what were the kind of invisible forces driving it. So in terms of where the opioid epidemic is today, well, here's the good news. I'll do the good news and then the bad news. The good news is that opioid prescribing quadrupled between the early 1990s and 2012. And with that quadrupling, we saw a fourfold increase in rates of addiction, opioid addiction, and rates of opioid overdose-related deaths. And it's now generally accepted as causal, which is to say the increase in prescribing gave way to the increase in use, addictive use, and overdose deaths. Since 2012, we have seen a decrease in opioid prescribing in this country by about 30 to 50%. So that is very good news. We have come down in terms of the amount of prescription opioids that we're just putting out there into society. The bad news is that we're still not where we need to be. Okay, so we're still prescribing at least double what we were prescribing in the 1990s without any increased need for analgesia in the population. So it's not like that doubling even now can be explained by an aging population or people getting more surgery or people getting sicker. And we're prescribing way more than any other rich nation in the world. We prescribe probably 30% of the world's opioids, despite the fact that we constitute less than 5% of the world's population. So really a significant lack of balance there. The other major problem is that what started out as a prescription opioid epidemic has now given way to heroin and illicit fentanyl. So we have way more deaths. In fact, deaths to illicit opioids has now surpassed deaths to prescription opioids. And that is a major problem today. Now you add to that the syndemic of COVID-19 and although we saw a slight decrease in opioid-related deaths in 2019, it looks like 2020 is proving to be a year in which we will go back up in terms of overall opioid overdoses, and may even have a record high this year because of people being isolated, because of an uncertain drug supply, people losing tolerance because they can't get their drug, then they lose tolerance and then they use their usual amount and they overdose because it's more than they're used to. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where things stand. We're making progress, but still not where we need to be.
Well, that's a lot. That's a lot going on. Is an opioid addiction more physically addictive than other substances?
I think it's fair to say that opioids are more physically addictive than many other substances because they create this phenomenon of dependence and really significant withdrawal. Now, it's not the only addictive substance that does that. In fact, alcohol does that, nicotine.
I feel like alcohol is the only drug that quitting can kill you, right? Yeah. Like right. just stopping alcohol use, that can shut your system down.
Absolutely. But the difference between alcohol and opioids is that it really takes sustained heavy alcohol use over many months to get to the point where your physiology is primed such that if you were to stop alcohol abruptly, you would go into life-threatening withdrawal or even significant withdrawal. Whereas that's not true with opioids. Even after 2 weeks of taking an opioid exactly as your doctor prescribed, when you stop it, you can experience, most people will in fact experience some degree of opioid withdrawal. And although opioid withdrawal is not typically life-threatening, it can be life-threatening if you have other comorbidities or you're older. So, and it's also, many people report, just excruciatingly painful. So in that sense, opioids are unique from other substances because of this very rapid tolerance and dependence and withdrawal when you stop. The other thing I think it's important to highlight about opioids that makes them unique is that the lethal dose and the therapeutic dose are very close. So it's really easy to overdose and die from opioids, especially if you accidentally combine them with a Xanax or with alcohol. What they do is they slow down your breathing rate, they slow down your heart rate, you fall asleep and you just don't wake up again. And that's not typical for other addictive drugs. The final thing that makes opioids unique, and this is a really, I think, important sociocultural aspect, is that we give away opioids as medicine. And there's almost no other highly addictive drug that we prescribe as medicine at the rate at which we prescribe opioids. Yeah. So that makes it for like a confusing narrative for people. It's like, well, I'm taking this as my medicine, but at the same time, it's a highly addictive drug.
And there's a number of narratives in play here, right? Like we have the narrative of Big Pharma, right? Yeah. Where they want money and they know that they are dealing with addictive substances. Why do we treat them, and maybe this is a question rather than a rhetorical question, why do we treat them differently than we treat tobacco and alcohol, like the industry?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, there is a good reason that we treat them differently. Obviously, we don't have good regulations in place, or the opioid epidemic wouldn't have happened, most likely. But the reason that we treat, big opioid or big pharma different from big tobacco is that there is consensus that opioids do have medicinal properties. And in fact, they're an indispensable tool in medicine. So I, as a physician, am incredibly grateful that I have opioids at my disposal to help people when they have a severe, horrific injury, let's say due to a motor vehicle accident. Perioperatively, there are many, many surgeries we would not be able to perform were it not for the grace of opioids and the analgesia they provide. And at the very end of life, it turns out it's really hard to let go of life, and dying can be hard. And so opioids are just a natural remedy to help people make that transition from life to death because they slow down the breathing and slow down the heart rate and essentially help people die. So opioids are an important tool in our medical toolbox. And therefore, we need reputable companies that make them and distribute them and dispense them, what the opioid pharmaceutical industry does. At the same time, you're absolutely right. They are highly addictive. So we really do have to classify them and view them differently from like a blood pressure medicine or your cholesterol medicine, or even aspirin and Tylenol. They are different. They need to be viewed differently, and they cannot be promoted in the same way that you would promote even other medicines.
Oh my God, promotion of medication is something that has been making me sick for the last 20 years.
Yeah. No, it's, even just the whole direct-to-consumer advertising is something that I think people really underestimate the impact of those ads. But most importantly, which is what my book talks a lot about, there's a lot of covert advertising that influences the practice of medicine that doctors themselves are totally unaware of, or even if they're aware, think they're immune to.
Yeah. So we addressed Big Pharma. Now I want to go to the next layer of the problem, which is how did the insurance industry contribute to the opioid crisis?
Okay. So, one thing to understand about how medicine has changed in the last 30 years is that most physicians and other healthcare providers are now salaried employees of large integrated healthcare centers. So for example, I get an annual salary, okay? And my salary really in many ways is indifferent to what I do, except that I have a billing quota. And I have to see a certain number of patients per year in order to meet my billing quota, okay? And there are a number of different ways that I can meet my billing quota. And there's something called relative value units, which is how they measure my productivity. So just to give you an example, if I spend an hour doing psychotherapy, I get about 1.5 relative value units. But if I spend 10 minutes prescribing a medication, I can make 3 to 5 relative value units. Okay. So now when you think about my time management and do I want to be in the office, from dawn till dusk, 7 days a week, or do I want to have a reasonable schedule where I can actually have time to exercise and go home and see my family and have some balance in life? Obviously, we all want the latter at the same time that we want to do right by our patients. But the result is that kind of reimbursement structure drives physicians and other healthcare providers into offering the types of treatments that are more readily reimbursed. So a lot of times people will misunderstand. They'll think, oh, you mean doctors get paid if they prescribe opioids? It's not quite that one-to-one. It's not that I prescribe a certain opioid and then like Purdue pays me for prescribing OxyContin. It's just that if I see a patient and I can bill medication management, then I can make a lot more relative value units to meet my billing quota in a shorter amount of time than if I were to just educate the patient or just do psychotherapy, which doesn't involve medication. And that's just psychiatry. Now you take that to pain medicine or primary care, it's the same problem. Primary care in particular, they have enormous pressure to see a lot of patients, to do it in a short amount of time, to get them in and out quickly. And these patients are presenting with a lot of complicated problems, including chronic pain. And one way to solve that problem in the short term is to prescribe an opioid. So you end up with a whole dynamic where the structure of care and the reimbursement model really incentivizes prescribing opioids and other short-term quick fixes for complex long-term problems. In the short term, they work. In the long term, they actually make those problems worse.
I just want to kind of check your phrasing of solve the problem, right? Like you're not solving nothing, right? Yeah. Like what is, and so this is in line with your book. I don't want it to feel like it's challenging or anything like that. But what we're seeing in your explanation is like, all right, the value I get for my time, I want the most value for my time. Of course. Mm-hmm. Now, the industry of insurance is as such that being an independent person, not with an HR department, not with a department that's going to do your paperwork or kind of like organize all of that stuff, that then becomes more cost for you. And so it it is very enticing, and almost like we've built a system that forces people to an extent. I mean, it doesn't force a person, but in terms of value for hours and life work balance, like there are a lot of incentives for being under a larger conglomerate, or however you kind of put it. So then, like, you get into this sort of world of profit real quickly, right? And now everybody is working for the profit of like, again, it just goes up, right? It's all traveling up. They're not paying you directly, but the indirect, like that second layer, is forcing you to make career choices and then care choices that are not actually solving problems.
Yeah, you said that beautifully. I agree with everything that you said. And I can tell you, as a healthcare provider, I have experienced this in real time where I felt that I was actually monetizing my patients. So, I mean, I went into medicine to do good and to care for people and to alleviate suffering. And yet I found myself caught up in this system of actually monetizing patients. What's the highest billing code I can use? How many diagnoses can I make that would make this patient tip over to a more complex patient, which would allow me to bill a more complicated billing code, which would increase my reimbursement. That's exactly what happens. And we're all caught up in that system. What's unique about our current circumstances, there's this kind of like an infrastructure which is somewhat removed. And so it's much easier, I think, to kind of rationalize and not see the ways in which we are monetizing patients and kind of perpetuating a system that's ultimately not really helping patients, but somehow keeps the churn going for the profit machine. And that's really scary.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So so we didn't talk about this, but I'm an addict, right? Like I'm an ex-addict. I got 20 years, December 14th. Thanks. One of the big things, like, and in my recovery, I dipped into gambling for a while. And, like one of the interesting things that I'm hearing relates to what we do is we create a place where there's no, you don't know the way out.
Yeah.
Right? We've created an industry in which you as a doctor now are in, and you are part of the casino.
Right.
And it's just a recognition of the fact that not only are you prescribing addictive things, you are practicing in an addictive way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that this relates to the way that we treat people in every industry.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. So from the top, we make this layered sandwich of disguise, mm-hmm. and then we have these Trojan horses that we send out into the home, right? From the commercials and ads that we see on our social media or on our Alexa or on our television, and then we go to the doctor and we say, hey, look, I have a problem that I didn't know I had, and then all of a sudden we're now involved and we are intermixed in a system of codependency, maybe even like that might even be where it's like you depend on your patients being sick in order to be able to do things. And really, maybe a lot of it is up here, because I know as an addict, like addiction, I have never experienced addiction, pure addiction. I've always seen comorbidity. I've always seen like other sorts of things like that, where it's like there is trauma that is underneath all of that we're trying to get out. Can you speak to that? Not that there's a question there, but I was just wondering, yeah.
Right. Well, I love your casino analogy, like how you're wandering around, how you wander around casinos and like you get lost and it all sort of looks the same. You can't find the exit and you're trapped there. That's great. And I do think that has to some extent happened in medicine where, you get kind of indoctrinated in the system, medical school, residency, fellowship, early career. and you've invested so much now. Like you're in the hole. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so you got to keep pulling that slot machine or playing that table to kind of get out of debt, to sort of make up for all of that you've been through. And so that's one way that you rationalize and justify not leaving the casino. Also, where else would you go? But also importantly, as you point out, you actually literally cannot find the exit. Like there isn't really anywhere else to go. This is how it's done. So it really does become a moral dilemma, I think, for many healthcare providers. How can I practice in a way that's congruent with my values and the reasons I went into medicine, and yet also acknowledge this system that really has me party to a kind of profit-driven machine that I didn't create, but I am integral to perpetuating. I think that's really, that's powerful, and that's true. Interestingly, when it comes to treating addiction, so historically, addiction treatment has not been part of the House of Medicine. It's been siloed and been outside. And one of the big pushes that many others have made is to, bring it into medicine, make sure insurance companies pay for addiction treatment. It really does work for some people when they actively engage in the treatment. So we want to make sure we're paying for it. But then you get into the same problems again, where you have sort of this, how can we deliver addiction treatment without, again, being focused on those aspects of treatment that are, monetarily advantageous for the system. And that's tough, because prescribing pills is one aspect of addiction treatment that is good for some people and useful and works. But on the other hand, it's very easy to do and very encouraged, because it's what works in our profit-driven medical system. Whereas other types of treatment, psychotherapy, group or individual, are not. They just don't reimburse at the same rate. They're more complicated to deliver. They take longer. They're slower. So we want to. Even as I and others in the field are encouraging addiction treatment, I think it's really important to encourage addiction treatment that includes not just these lucrative sort of medication-based treatments.
Or we need to figure out a way to make it lucrative. Meaning
Right.
We need to figure out what the value of that is, because the value to society of having an addict that is now contributing to society is a lot bigger than the value of contributing to the addiction of a citizen.
Absolutely. These are huge societal problems, the solutions of which take a long time, and the benefits of which take decades. No, you're absolutely right. And so can we, as a society, do the same thing that you have to do when you're recovering from addiction and delay gratification? Can we invest in solutions that we won't see the benefits of until decades from now? And that's essentially what we have to do, but that's not what we do. We want the immediate payoff. So
that's true. When someone has a problem, what is, in your experience or with your knowledge, what is the responsibility of Big Pharma? Do they work and do they have any arm that works in the realm of bringing people back from what they've created? Or is that then just a societal problem now? Is their profit just turning into a societal problem, or are they contributing to the solution to the problems they created?
Well, they definitely have a responsibility to steward opioid pain pills in a way that impacts the public to the public good and not to the public harm. And the lawsuits that you read about every day in the paper against the pharmaceutical opioid industry are claiming exactly that they did not steward these pills in the way that they should have, that they've created a quote unquote public nuisance. That's a legal term to refer to doing something that creates a large harm to a large segment of the society. And the main allegation, against Purdue Pharma and other opioid manufacturers is that they oversold the benefits and underplayed the risks. Through their misleading messaging and marketing, they said opioids are more effective than they really are, and they said opioids are less risky than they really are. And specifically, they underplayed the risk of addiction. They said as long as you're getting your opioids from a doctor and you have real pain, you can't get addicted. And essentially that's totally untrue. One in 4 chronic pain patients receiving opioids from their doctor, taking them as prescribed, will develop an opioid use disorder through the process of being treated for a pain condition. So it's a very high rate. When you think about typical adverse medical events, a rare condition is less than 1 in 100. We're talking 1 in 4 people will develop some kind of opioid use problem. So it's a very high risk. It's not a small risk. And patients need to be informed when they're starting an opioid, even for short term, even for limited health condition, that there's a risk that they will not be able to get off of them, or that they will flip into addiction. And so that's the main that's the main way in which Purdue Pharma and others did not take the responsibility that was theirs. The others is also the distributors. These are the trucks that transported the pills out to small rural communities in West Virginia that had one little pharmacy and yet received millions and millions of pills, in a small town of 12,000 or something. So that those individuals too had a responsibility to monitor what's called suspicious orders and to alert the public and the industry when a small town with 12,000 people was getting millions of opioids. They, the accusation in the lawsuit and the litigation is that they did not do that. Likewise, the pharmacies themselves, dispensing the pills, patients coming in clearly misusing or diverting, clearly addicted, needed to alert the authorities, take action. And the allegations in the litigation is that they did, Walgreens, Walmart, CVS, they did not do that either. So that's essentially the lawsuit and the accusation. And it all goes back to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 that established that within our pharmacopoeia of medicines, there are certain medicines that are addictive. Those are called controlled substances. And that if a medicine is allocated as a controlled substance, it will be scheduled 1 through 5 based on how addictive it is. And then based on where it is on that schedule, there are all kinds of regulations that need to be followed about suspicious monitoring, adverse medical events. So for example, shortly after OxyContin was released, there were reports that were going into the FDA and to Purdue Pharma that people were getting addicted, they were misusing it, they were diverting it, and essentially those reports were ignored, not just by Purdue, but also on some level by the FDA. So it's not just these pharmaceutical companies, it's also the watchdog organizations, the DEA and the FDA, which again didn't, they weren't driving the bus, so to speak, when it should have been, or asleep at the wheel, or whatever metaphor you want to use.
I listen to this and I can't help but think of like the Yale prison experiment, right?
Stanford prison experiment, not the Yale prison experiment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I mean, I have a lot more compassion for the person who's low on the totem pole, who just goes along, than I do for the person who's high on the totem pole and who just goes along. For example, Purdue executives, those are individuals making a lot of money with a lot of power. For that matter, the Sackler family, the founding family of Purdue Pharma. I mean, these are individuals, they were in a position of responsibility and they were making a lot of money. They're the ones who should have been more guided by a moral compass and done something much earlier. Like your average pharmacist working at the window, I mean, there are a lot of heroes, small town heroes, who did call this out. But in general, I think, it's just not human nature for most of us to go against the grain, especially when our very job is at stake, and paying the bill. But so yes, I agree with you. There's sort of this, kind of herd mentality that we're all vulnerable to, unless you're a natural contrarian. And by the way, many people with addiction are natural contrarians. It's part of their superpowers, their unrecognized superpowers. But most people are just happy to go along. And
I'm not blaming those people. They are put in a position. We created a system. So Big Pharma, and the FDA and all of them, they are the ones that are creating a system that we know creates a situation where people won't speak up.
Yeah.
We've created that system. And so when you say, yes, it's Big Pharma's responsibility, yeah, they created a system. So now we're in this like loop where we're expecting the people that are most unethical to be the most ethical.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're getting at, which I think is a good point, is that these corporations, including opioid manufacturers, distribution pharmacies, at the very highest level, not at the level of the average worker, but at the very highest level, the C-suite people really do have a responsibility. And they can't just say, well, we're following the law, or we haven't broken any laws, or, this is our business model. We're doing everything according to the rules. That's not sufficient because they have so much power and they influence so many lives. They have to take more responsibility than that and look at the impact of their product and then change what they're doing if the impact is not positive.
This is a big topic. People's lives had been, if I'm going to not mince words, had been targeted for profit.
Mm-hmm.
And we utilized, and the largest companies, the people who were going to make the most, who had the most to profit, utilized a number of different industries to gain allies by just making it impossible to work around, right? Like if you're going to say, okay, look, I'm going to pay you for an hour and you can either work 10 minutes or an hour and a half, which would you prefer? Like, we all want to make more for our time and we all feel like we're worth that, and we are. It's a societal thing that we've created, and now we're in the midst of it. And that addiction to money, that addiction to our society that we have right now is the thing that, and we're okay with that. We're okay with Big Pharma making all this money, but we're not okay with someone using like, who has a $300 a day opium habit.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, and that is the sort of addiction that each one of us, like whether we have an addiction to Amazon or an addiction to social media or whatever, like we're being targeted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think, your point is a great one. And it's the point I try to make in my new book, which is just that capitalism by definition promotes consumption, and consumption is the pathway to addiction, whatever the substance is. And so that really makes us, the whole system is driving a kind of addictive orientation to life. And it is really the dark side of capitalism.
Doctor, it was so great to talk with you.
Yeah, great to talk with you too. Thanks for having me.
Wow. Okay, I want to break something down for you. Not that you need it, but when we looked at doctors, we as a society agreed that what they said had a lot of sway due to their being at the top of the health hierarchy. It is because of this that all medical schools administer some sort of ethical oath, most notably the Hippocratic Oath, right? As Dr. Lembke points out, the system we've created over the last 50 or 60 years no longer puts doctors at the top of that hierarchy. They are simply the employees in a system which their voices and desires and demands can easily get lost in the suggestion box. Yet, they are still the only ones taking the ethical oaths, not their bosses and not the drivers of the products of the industry. This is not to say that doctors are not being ethical, but it is always good to keep in mind how those who we may want advocating for us may actually be advocating for themselves, or even worse, a profit-driven industry. If you are recovering and you have a sponsor, psychologist, psychiatrist, doctors, family, and friends, all of those may all be essentials. However, that notwithstanding, you are always going to be your biggest and best advocate. But you're going to have to think clearly, because being manipulated is so easy. And if it's easy, it's addictive. In the description of this episode, you'll find links to get Dr. Lembke's book, Drug Dealer MD, as well as links to pre-order her upcoming book, Dopamine Nation, which is all about how we're all addicted to constant dopamine responses. Please rate and review this podcast and or leave comments for this episode to help me better create helpful content. You can support this show at anchor.fm or support me and my work at Patreon, where you will get access to unedited content as well as writings and one-on-one access to supporter group portrait sessions with me. If you're interested in working together, head over to MartinJon.com, where you can sign up for a free 30-minute call. I work with individuals and host workshops for groups. This is the Recover Yourself podcast, and I want to thank you for listening. And until next time, keep recovering yourself.